always did have a way of finding the truth, even when the truth didn't want to be found. I'm calling in a favor. Not official, not recorded. And if you're smart, you'll hang up right now and forget this message ever reached you. But I know you won't. We've got a situation. Rural location, a quiet place. The kind of place that doesn't make reports unless something forces it to. At first, it looked like nothing. Every system, every sensor, every human report coming back the same way. All readings normal. That phrase again and again, different hands, different times. Like they were copied, or remembered, or placed. You ever see that before? Because I have, and every time it showed up, we were already too late. This isn't noise, and it sure as hell isn't coincidence. Something is happening out there, and whatever it is, it doesn't leave tracks. It doesn't leave heat. It doesn't leave damage that makes sense. But it leaves patterns, and you were always good with patterns. I've got a team mobilizing, good people capable. But they're walking into this blind, and I don't send people in blind if I can help it. That's where you come in? I need you to take a look before we step any further into this. Tell me what we're missing. Tell me what this really is. Because if I'm right, we're not dealing with an event. We're dealing with something that knows how to make events disappear. I have the address listed below and the contacts on site. Here is the letter from the POTUS confirming 47 is green lit. You'll know how to get the rest. Do try not to take too long. We're already late. Let me know your decision soon.
As we begin to walk with Lieutenant Daniel Hawk Mercer, he had never trusted a room that felt too settled. Too quiet, in his experience, was rarely peace. More often, it was the thin skin stretched over something not yet ready to move. The office assigned to him at the edge of the early Site 47 complex had that kind of quiet. It was late enough that the hallway beyond the frosted glass panel had gone dark except for one yellow bulb burning near the far turn, and Lampy on his desk gave the room a warm, narrow pool of light that left the corners to their own intentions. Paper covered nearly every open surface. Not disorderly, not quite. Hawk's hand had been in every stack. Reports from incidents that had never made it into any official training manual. Field notes from county deputies, engineers, weather observers, medics, utility workers, and once a Baptist preacher who had described an event with more discipline than most captains Hawk had known. He sat in rolled sleeves, tie loosened, metal frame glasses low on his nose, one hand holding, open a report while the other rested near a pencil worn down to a sharp, practical nub. He read the way some men tracked blood sign in pine straw, not skimming, not hoping, not making assumptions. He let patterns reveal themselves by refusing to hurry them, and that habit had taken him places other men called dead ends. The file open before him had started as a brush fire incident from years back, something small enough to have been buried by any clerk who wanted a cleaner shelf. An abandoned tenant house outside a county line had been found with the rear wall charred black from foundation to roof beam, yet the grass around it had remained green enough to bend under dew. Inside, 3 kitchen chairs had been reduced to warped skeletons, while the table between them held an untouched bowl filled with dust and paper ash. Hawk had read that line 5 times. He circled it once in red pencil, then drew a second mark around the responding officer's wording. Heat damage inconsistent with spread pattern. That was the phrase that mattered. Not because it was elegant, but because it was careful. Most men wrote loose when they were scared or confused. This officer had written like a man refusing to lie to himself. Hawk leaned back and reached for the next sheet in the packet, a supplemental note added 2 weeks later by an insurance adjuster who had inspected the property after the county cleared it. Structural timbers had twisted inward, not outward, and several metal fixtures showed signs of exposure to extreme heat without corresponding smoke saturation. Hawk set the page down, folded his hands once, then reopened the file from the top as if he had not just read it. He trusted repetition more than memory. Memory liked stories. Repetition told him where the bones were. There had been other files before this one, enough to build a shelf of careful impossibilities. A stretch of woods in Tennessee where tree bark blistered on one side only, all facing the same direction, though no strike pattern or burn front could be identified. A section of road in eastern Arkansas where asphalt had softened overnight in a clean oval patch while nearby frost held on fence rails until noon. A boathouse on the Gulf that had been found with its roof beams bowed upward, as though heat had lifted them from beneath and then withdrawn before flame could follow. Every report had come from a different county, a different year, a different set of eyes. On paper, none of them belonged together. That was how such things stayed invisible. Give a strange event enough distance from the next strange event, and people call it coincidence, then professionalism, then paperwork. Hawk had spent most of his life around people who believed every mystery was solved by naming the most convenient cause and filing the rest under fatigue, panic, weather, or human error. He had never shared that faith. Problems that truly repeated themselves were either being ignored by lazy men or protected by capable ones. He had not yet decided which possibility bothered him more. Somewhere beyond the closed blinds, a generator hummed low and steady in the outer yard. The sound grounded the room, but only barely. Hawk looked again at the blackened house photo clipped to the report and saw what had bothered him from the first glance. The burn had not traveled. It had occupied. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose once. Then he reached for the memo that had brought him here in the first place. Appears to be reassignment language, temporary review authority, interagency coordination. No specifics, plenty of silence. It had arrived clean, unsigned by anyone willing to stand in front of it, and that alone had made him accept. Men who hid their names were telling him something before he even reached the room. He slid the memo under the fire report and compared dates. He compared counties, compared attached photographs, compared temperatures. Then he stopped over one image and held it there under the lamp. The rear wall of the house had not collapsed. It had folded inward in a curve so slight most men would miss it, but Hawk saw it now and kept seeing it. The wood did not fail like that in ordinary fire. It did not bow with such smoothness unless heat had pressed it all at once from a single dominating force. He set the picture down without haste, but something in his posture sharpened. Outside the office, the facility remained still. Inside it, something had just aligned. He marked the margin once more and wrote 5 words in neat block print. Flame static. Structure reacted first. Then he looked toward the dark window as if measuring the distance between himself and a thing he could not yet name. The flame in that house had not moved. Everything else had. Brick Holloway did not belong to the sort of men who liked being summoned without purpose. He liked orders when they were clean, work when it was useful, and silence when it meant people were finally doing their jobs. So, when Hawk asked him to meet before sunrise at the far training yard behind the temporary barracks, Brick arrived with suspicion already packed and waiting. The air was cold enough to sting the back of his throat, and the field lamps threw long cones of white across packed gravel, chain-link fencing, stacked crates, and a row of weather-darkened railroad ties used for obstacle drills. Brick wore field boots and a gray t-shirt under an open fatigue jacket, steam lifting from the coffee in his hand as he crossed the yard. He spotted Hawk standing near the fence line, sleeves rolled, tie absent for once, one boot braced on the bottom rail as if he had been there long enough to settle into the dark. He did not look like a recruiter. He looked like a man listening to something far away. Brick slowed, took that in, and filed it where he filed useful oddities. Hawk turned his head only after Brick was 10 feet away, as though he had known exactly where he was all along and simply waited for the right distance.
You said 5:30.
Brick muttered, checking the dim sky.
Either this is urgent or you've developed a personal grudge against sleep.
Hawk took that without smiling.
Could be both.
They stood side by side for a moment with the yard between them and the waking facility still mostly dark behind them. Brick had worked with officers who tried to impress through mystery, and Hawk was not one of them. What he withheld because he thought premature language damaged clean thinking. That made him either disciplined or dangerous depending on the assignment. Brick had not yet decided which label fit better.
You know why they pulled me in?
Brick asked. Hawk's answer came without padding.
Because you finish what you start, and because you know the difference between something being lost and something choosing not to leave a trail.
Brick glanced at him then. That was not common phrasing. Most men would have said tracking, search patterns, recon discipline, field leadership. Choosing not to leave a trail sounded like the sentence belonged to a different room than the one they were standing in. Hawk rested both forearms on the fence and watched the wind move the top wire in a faint metallic shimmer.
You were in eastern Kentucky 2 years ago. Floodplain sweep. Missing county worker.
Brick's jaw shifted once giving himself away. Hawk saw it, nodded.
Your after-action note said the prints continued across wet ground for 90 yards, then stopped in open clay with no return disturbance, no lateral break, no sink, no tree shelter, and no evidence the subject doubled back.
Brick did not answer immediately. The memory came back whole. Mud that should have recorded everything. Tracks that had ended mid-stride like a film cut. Men on his team joking less and less as the daylight thinned. Brick took a long swallow of his cooling coffee and stared into the yard, seeing another place over top of this one. He remembered the flood stink in the air that week, the gnats, the ruined fence posts, the muck sucking at his boots, and that inexplicable line of footprints leading out from the broken service truck toward a stand of cypress. The prints had been clear. Heel, toe, weight, depth, angle. A tired man walking fast. Then nothing. No jump marks. No drag. No slide, no branch disturbance, no impressions beyond the last full print, which had sunk deeper than the rest, as if all the man's weight had gathered there for one final step that never landed. Brick had written the truth in his report and watched it come back sanitized 2 weeks later with terms like washout interference and probable footing misread. He had signed the amended copy because the dead stayed dead whether paperwork respected them or not, but he had not forgotten the original ground.
That the kind of thing this is?
As he asked at last. Hawk's reply was quiet.
It's one of the kinds.
Brick exhaled through his nose, annoyed more by the accuracy than the vagueness.
That answer's not good enough for most men.
Hawk finally turned to face him fully.
I didn't ask most men.
There it was. Not pride, but selection. Brick could work with that, even if he disliked being handled. What he could not ignore was the fact that Hawk had found the one field report Brick himself had almost convinced himself to stop thinking about. Hawk reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet, worn soft at the creases from repeated reading. He handed it over without explanation. Brick opened it under the yard light. It was not an order set, not exactly. A provisional assignment notice. Embedded response coordination. Restricted access. No mission profile attached. At the bottom, one line in Hawk's own handwriting need. Someone who trusts ground over theory. Brick read it twice. The cold had sharpened by then, and the eastern horizon was beginning to bleach from black to slate. Somewhere across the compound, a truck engine coughed awake, then settled into idle. Brick folded the paper once more, slower this time.
You still haven't told me what this is.
Hawk nodded toward the page in his hand.
Because if I did, you'd spend the next hour deciding whether you believe me. I'd rather spend that hour seeing whether you'll come.
Brick looked at him a long moment, then back toward the fence line where dawn was trying to gather itself from darkness. He thought of wet clay ending for no reason, of amended reports, of quiet men selecting quiet men. He tucked the paper into his jacket pocket.
Ground doesn't swallow men. No, not unless something tells it to.
Brick did not say yes. He simply stayed where he was. For Hawk, that was answer enough.
3, 4, mama, now I'm gonna sing you some more. First phase, it broke me down. Second phase, I started coming round. Third phase, I was lean and mean. Graduation, standing tall in my green with the belly.
By the time Hawk found Dr. Lex Reyes, the day had already been too long for everyone inside the field hospital except her. Exhaustion moved around some people like weather. Around Lex, it seemed to stop, reassess, and choose a different corridor. The place itself carried the usual smell of antiseptic, old fabric, warm machinery, and the faint copper ghost that never quite left any room where trauma had passed through. Canvas partitions divided narrow treatment spaces. Overhead lights hummed softly. Somewhere down the ward, a man coughed in his sleep, and another muttered through a dream bad enough to stiffen his arm against the sheet. Lex stood at a stainless table near the back supply room, sleeves pushed to the elbow, dark hair pinned up carelessly. A chart opened beside a tray of cleaned instruments she was reorganizing with the unhurried efficiency of someone who believed precision was a kind of mercy. She was not young, not in the way the recruits were young, but there was nothing diminished about her. The years had sharpened her instead of softening her, and the scars she carried, both the visible and the buried ones, had arranged themselves into discipline rather than fragility. Hawk paused long enough in the doorway to watch her finish a line on the chart before she acknowledged him. She did not startle.
If you've come to complain about my handwriting,
She said without looking up.
Take a number.
Hawk answered in the same register.
I was going to complain about your habit of noticing things I'd prefer stayed hidden.
At got her eyes on him. They moved to a quieter corner near a stack of supply crates where the ward noise thinned into a distant blanket of human fatigue. Lex crossed her arms and studied him with the calm suspicion of someone who had been lied to by polished men often enough to value blunt ones. Hawk handed her a folder. She did not open it immediately.
this a transfer?
She asked.
Sort of.
He said.
That means yes, with less paperwork.
She replied. Then she opened it. Inside were not her own records, not assignment changes, not commendations. They were case summaries, photos clipped to typed reports, temperature charts, incident notes, a rural bedroom with one side of the mattress blackened but the curtain beside it untouched, a truck cab where the steering wheel had warped while the vinyl dash showed no scorch tracing, a barn interior with rafters darkened in localized arcs as if an invisible torch had hovered there in disciplined passes. Lex flipped through them in silence that lasted long enough to tell Hawk she was taking them seriously.
Why am I reading structural reports?
She asked, flipping through the file.
Because bodies and buildings fail honestly when people don't, and I need somebody who recognizes the difference.
Lex's gaze sharpened over the top of the page. That was a better answer. She returned to the file and stopped over a photograph of a man's upper back from an older incident report. The skin was patterned with injury that resembled severe thermal exposure, yet the fabric of the undershirt cut away around the wound showed only minor singe marks. She turned to the medical note attached and read the entry twice.
I saw one like this in Alaska.
She said finally, voice flatter than before.
Not the same shape, but the same argument.
Hawk waited. Lex set the folder down and looked not at him, but somewhere just past his shoulder into a year she clearly disliked revisiting.
Embassy support route, winter season. We took fire, treated it like fire, and lost time because the damage didn't behave. Skin blistered, underlayers cooked in patches. Clothing intact in places it should have burned through first. It looked like heat, but it didn't travel through the body the way heat travels. It occupied tissue and stopped. Clean borders where borders shouldn't exist.
She paused, not for effect, but because memory required a little space to pass through the jaw unclenched.
The official language blamed fuel flare and pressure exposure. That language was written by men who weren't in the room.
Hawk believed her before she finished the sentence. He had read enough official language to know when it had been built as shelter instead of truth. Lex tapped the photo on top of the file.
Whatever touched this man knew where it was going. Injury without proper transfer path. Damage without behavior.
She finally met Hawk's eyes again.
So why am I really here?
Hawk took a breath, then answered with no flourish.
Because I think there are incidents being treated as unrelated failure events, and I think the people writing them off are either blind or instructed. I need someone who knows what a wound looks like when the wound is lying.
Lex closed the folder and rested a palm on top of it as if feeling for whatever current had run through all those pages before it reached her table. In the ward behind them, a cartwheel squeaked once, annoyingly loud in the lull, then faded off toward the far stations. She glanced toward the patients, then back to Hawk, measuring more than the request. She was measuring whether the work had a center, whether it would lead somewhere honest, whether she would be expected to dull her own perception to fit the clean edges of a command structure. Hawk seemed to know that and did not rush her.
I'm not asking for a medic. I've got medics. I'm asking for someone who can look at damage and tell me when cause and effect have separated.
Lex let that settle. There was no vanity in it. He was not flattery. He was identifying function. She respected that more than she would ever say aloud. At last, she tucked the folder under one arm.
If this turns out to be another room full of men using bigger words for smaller truths, I'm leaving you to drown in your own reports.
Hawk inclined his head once.
Fair enough.
She gave the smallest hint of a humorless smile, then reached for her coat from the hook behind the door. As she slid her arms into it, she said almost to herself,
The body knew it had been burned.
Hawk looked at her. Lex adjusted the collar, eyes distant for half a second.
Even when nothing had touched it.
Well, that was the answer he had come for, whether either of them liked the shape of it or not.
All grief to refrain, for we may or might never all meet here again. Here's a health to the dear lass that I love so well, for her style and her beauty sure none can excel. There's a smile on her countenance as she sits on my knee. There's no man in this wide world as happy as...
The records room at the Provisional Site 47 facility did not feel like part of the same building as the rest of the compound. Out in the active corridors, there were boots, clipped voices, doors opening and shutting, telephones that rang too sharply, and the restless choreography of people trying to give shape to an operation still missing its proper name. The records room stood outside all that, tucked behind a reinforced fire door at the end of a hall no one used unless paper forced them there. Its light was softer, its air cooler, and its silence belonged less to emptiness than to storage. Metal cabinets lined the walls in patient rows. Card catalogs occupied an entire side station near the center table, their narrow drawers labeled in careful block print with counties, dates, agencies, and classifications that had changed often enough to suggest someone was always reorganizing the truth. The young analyst assigned to the room moved through it with the care of a person who had learned that documents made more noise when mishandled than when read. Her name was Miriam Vale, though most of the staff still called her the analyst as if the room itself had grown her out of paper. She was younger than the officers who began drifting toward Hawk's orbit, but not timid, not really. Her caution came from intelligence, not insecurity. She wore a plain blouse under a cardigan that had collected a dusting of file grit at the sleeve, and she balanced a stack of county reports against her hip while checking serial codes against a long, handwritten intake sheet. Outside, men trained. Here, language stayed in place long enough to betray itself. Miriam had not been looking for a pattern when she first noticed it. She had been correcting filing inconsistencies caused by a transfer from two separate archives, one military and one civilian. And the work was boring in exactly the way that allows the mind to catch details pride might miss. One weather event report from southern Missouri used the phrase environmental conditions stable despite witness concern. Another, from 6 years earlier in rural Alabama, concluded with environmental conditions stable, no anomaly detected. A utility survey from Mississippi read all local readings within expected range. In isolation, the language meant very little. Bureaucracies trained men to speak in flattening terms. But as she sorted, stacked, and cross-indexed, Miriam began to feel the pressure of repetition. Not broad repetition, specific repetition. Certain phrases arrived with too much structural similarity in reports that should have been written by different kinds of people under different stressors with different technical vocabularies. She started placing those reports aside. First on impulse, then with method, a deputy's after-action note, a Corps of Engineers site review, a volunteer fire assessment, a coroner's supplemental appendix. Different regions, different decades, different typewriters even. Yet the same underlying phrasing kept surfacing like something beneath the surface, nudging the same spot with increasing boldness. She began a second pile, then a third. By lunch, she had 4 piles arranged by wording family instead of date, and by the end of the day, she had stopped pretending this was a filing quirk. She carried the most troubling stack to the center table and read each report aloud under her breath, not because she enjoyed hearing herself speak, but because language revealed rhythm when sounded. There it was again. Not identical sentence for sentence, but close enough to raise the hairs on her forearms. No evidence of ongoing disturbance. All conditions nominal. No measurable cause for concern. All readings normal. She underlined the last phrase in 3 different documents and stared at the ink impressions as if the paper might admit who had taught those words to so many unrelated hands. Some reports were original carbon copies, some transcription retypes from field notes, some official summaries prepared later. Yet the phrasing gathered itself at the end like a signature returning in different clothing. Miriam pulled one old county report from 1959 beside a more recent engineering file and noticed something worse. The older report's typeface changed slightly in the last line. The strike was cleaner, darker, as if the sheet had been returned to the machine after the body text was complete. As she checked another and another, the same thing. On a third report, the final line sat microscopically higher than the rest, almost invisible unless one looked for it. She sat back in her chair, suddenly aware of the hum of the ceiling vent and the small, dry sound of paper shifting under her hand. This was no longer pattern recognition. This was intrusion. Someone, somewhere, had not merely used the same wording. Someone had taught the paperwork how to close its own mouth. Miriam reached for a yellow memo card, wrote 3 notations in a tight hand, then stopped before filing them to the outgoing tray. She did not yet know whether the right move was to alert the duty office, take the stack directly to Hawk, or lock the cabinet and say nothing until she understood the scope of what she was holding. Caution won the first round. She gathered the reports, slid them into a separate file jacket, and marked it only with a pencil slash no one else would notice. Then she opened one final folder from a county shelf in Alabama, mostly because the date and classification aligned with another anomaly index she had seen earlier in the week. The incident summary itself was ordinary in structure until the last paragraph. There it was again, cleaner than it had any right to be. All readings normal. Miriam stared at the line until the room seemed to narrow around it. No, she whispered, not frightened exactly, but unwilling to let the page finish the thought unchallenged. She wrote one more note on the yellow card, this time more carefully than before. Repeated closure language across unrelated events. Possible post-entry alteration. Then she slid the card into the front pocket of the file instead of the outgoing tray. The reports were not being written, they were being repeated.
Well, it's time to go. I hate to leave you, but I really must say, so good night, sweetheart, good night.
When Site 47 first began to gather itself into something more permanent than an idea with armed doors, it felt less like the birth of a unit and more like the temporary camp of a conversation no one had yet admitted to having. The main structures were already standing, but the place still wore incompletion openly. Fresh concrete sweated pale dust at the edges. Wiring crews moved in and out of ceiling access panels. A motor pool had been marked off behind a berm but still smelled more of paint and machine oil than use. The mess hall served hot food in a room where half the chairs did not match. Offices existed before their labels did. People arrived with orders that said enough to compel movement, but never enough to explain purpose. By the time Hawk, Brick, Lex, and Miriam found themselves in the same operational orbit, each of them had already sensed the same thing from a different angle. The facility had not been built around a mission everyone understood. It had been built around a mission someone was trying not to name too soon. The first formal meeting took place in a narrow conference room on the second floor, one window blacked out from the outside, the other looking over the backyard where supply trucks rolled in under tarps. A single long table occupied most of the space. At its center sat a metal file box with 2 clasps and no visible classification marking beyond a stenciled number half-sanded from the lid. Hawk arrived first and took the chair nearest the box without touching it. Brick came next, carrying the look of a man who trusted rooms least when they were newly painted. Lex entered with a notebook and no patience. Miriam arrived last, balancing 3 folders against her chest, aware enough to know she was the youngest and unbothered enough not to apologize for it. For a time, no one spoke. It was not awkward silence. It was evaluation, Brick watched Hawk. Lex watched the box. Miriam watched all three of them and understood before the first word that this room had been assembled on purpose. Different tools laid on the same table. Hawk finally broke the quiet by sliding a thin packet to each seat. Inside were clip summaries, not the full archives, just enough to irritate people who valued context. A structure fire with no spread pattern. A floodplain disappearance with no continuation of prints. Thermal injuries inconsistent with contact or blast profile. Environmental logs showing abrupt heat spikes without stable source readings. Lex flipped pages faster than Brick, but Brick absorbed faster than Lex wanted to give him credit for. Miriam recognized 2 report IDs she herself had re-indexed in the records room. Hawk let them read.
What am I supposed to be seeing?
Brick asked after a minute. Hawk answered.
What refuses to fit?
Lex made a small sound in the back of her throat, neither agreement nor objection. Miriam spoke before she meant to.
Or what keeps being forced to fit?
The room turned slightly toward her. She did not shrink. Hawk gave one measured nod as if a point on an internal map had just lit up.
Exactly.
Brick leaned back in his chair and stared at the packet.
So this is why we're here. House fires, missing tracks, bad medical reporting, weather glitches, and paper with an attitude problem.
Hawk's expression did not change.
That's what we can say out loud.
Something passed between them then that had very little to do with friendship and almost everything to do with recognition. None of them had been brought there because they were the easiest people to manage. Brick had too much grounded instinct to swallow bad field logic. Lex refused false cleanup language on principle. Miriam saw structural repetition in places where most people saw clerical noise. Hawk collected anomalies the way some men collected debt. In another command, they might have spent months irritating one another. Here, the irritation felt built into the design. It was the mechanism, not the flaw. Hawk laid both hands flat on the table.
Listen carefully. You were selected because each of you has already run into a version of this in the wild and refused to domesticate it afterward. Whatever this assignment becomes, it starts there.
Lex's eyes stayed on the packet.
And what is it exactly?
Hawk looked at the metal file box but still did not touch it.
A response structure to a pattern that predates the structure.
That answer left enough room to be honest and still withheld enough to keep the room taut. Brick did not like it, but he recognized the shape of partial truth when a man gave it cleanly. Miriam opened one of her folders and slid a short index sheet onto the table.
These are the reports with repeated closure phrasing, different years, different agencies, similar final language.
Hawk glanced at it, then at her.
How many?
More than there should be.
That earned another small nod. At last, Hawk reached for the box at the center of the table. The clasps gave with a dull metallic click that sounded louder than it should have. Inside lay a single thick file, bound in dark board, no type title, no stamped warning, no agency seal. Only a symbol had been drawn on the cover in black ink, the lines old enough to have softened at the edges from handling. It was not decorative and not familiar. Brick leaned in slightly without meaning to. Lex's brow tightened. Miriam felt the oddest sensation of recognition with no source attached, as if she had seen the shape once in the margin of another file and failed to remember it until now. Hawk turned the binder so the others could see it better and said nothing for several seconds. The room seemed to contract around that mark. It was not a name. It was worse than a name because names allowed a person to believe something had been contained by language. This symbol suggested the opposite. It suggested that language had failed first. Hawk finally rested 2 fingers against the edge of the file, still not opening it.
We're going to build from the outside in, no assumptions, no mythology, no heroics.
Brick's gaze stayed on the cover.
And when do we get told what that is?
Hawk answered without moving his hand.
When it stops looking like ink.
There wasn't a name on it. Just something that looked like it should never have been written down at all. Months later, after the walls had picked up the smell of lived-in paper and the team had settled into one another's rhythms without ever becoming comfortable, the room in Hawk's office looked almost exactly like the sort of place from which small truths escaped and larger ones were pinned down by force. The lamp on his desk burned warm against the cooler overhead light, giving his corner of the office a domestic feel that nothing else in the room deserved. Reports lay open in layered spreads over the desk, side table, and even the edge of a spare chair dragged in from the hall. Brick stood near the filing cabinet with one hand on his hip and the other wrapped around a mug of coffee he had forgotten to drink. Lex occupied the side of the main table, one shoulder against the wall, reading without fidgeting. Miriam sat in the chair opposite Hawk, 3 files open before her, and a legal pad filled with arrows, dates, and underlined phrases. Outside the window, early evening was settling over the yard in a gray wash, but inside the room time seemed to have narrowed to paper, lamp heat, and the soft abrasion of pages turning. No one had raised a voice. That was not their way. Yet the tension in the office had become unmistakable over the last hour, not because any single report proved anything on its own, but because too many of them had begun bending toward the same center. Hawk removed his glasses, cleaned one lens with the edge of a handkerchief, and put them back on. Again, he said. Miriam knew which stack he meant. She pulled the next report free and began summarizing without embellishment. County Utility Inspection, Northern Louisiana. Late summer. Unexplained transformer failure at a substation edge. Heat damage observed on outer casing, but surrounding grass and support poles showed no corresponding exposure pattern. Weather normal. Witness reports inconsistent. Final line. All local readings within normal ranges. Brick made a dry sound.
Transformer cooks itself, but the grass next to it stays polite.
Lex took the page when Miriam offered it and scanned the photo attachments. The casing did not appear exploded. It appeared stressed, as though heated from the inside by something more exact than malfunction. Hawk reached for another file without waiting. Volunteer fire response, Western Georgia. Barn loft. No ignition source identified. Rafters warped in parallel arcs. Hay bales below untouched, except for surface dehydration. Final line. Environmental conditions stable, no anomaly detected. Brick shook his head once.
Men write like that when they're being told where the thought ends.
Miriam had already marked 3 parallel examples in her notes from 2 decades apart. A coastal road report, a school boiler room incident, a wildlife station sensor event. Different jargon, same closure instinct. Hawk spread the pages side by side until the desk looked less like a workspace and more like the top layer of an excavation.
Look past the event type. Look at what the reports are trying to do.
Lex didn't answer right away. She was comparing not the body of the text, but the way each report ended.
Close it. They're all trying to close it.
The more they read, the less the events themselves seemed like the central anomaly. Fire without spread, heat without source, deformation without proper transfer, missing sequences in field progression. All of that mattered. But the thing that truly unified the files was the behavior of the language afterward. Reports that should have ended uncertainly ended neatly. Reports that should have forced follow-up settled into official calm. Miriam turned one page toward Hawk and pointed with the eraser end of her pencil.
This was a handwritten field note before it was typed into the report. See the transcription flag.
Hawk looked over her shoulder and nodded.
Then why does the final sentence use the same closure phrase as the engineering summary from 13 years later?
Brick set his mug down untouched on the file cabinet.
Because someone's teaching them how to end.
Lex finally pushed away from the wall and came to the desk, laying a medical incident photo beside the utility report.
Or something is...
The room went still at that. Not dramatic stillness, working stillness. No one rushed to argue because each of them had already entertained some version of that possibility in private. Hawk drew a line with his pencil between 2 reports from different states and then another between a fire summary and an environmental survey.
Different departments, different reporting chains. No shared clerk, no shared terminology training, no shared office culture.
He tapped the bottom lines one after the other.
Same instinct at the point of closure.
Miriam felt the hair rise again along her forearm, the same way it had in the records room. The paperwork was not merely similar, it was behaving. By the time the room had circled back through the fourth stack, darkness had gathered outside the window enough to turn the glass into a dim mirror. Lamplight shone across Hawk's desk and threw the papers into an uneven landscape of pale rectangles and shadowed margins. Lex stopped over a final page and narrowed her eyes.
Here, look at this one.
It was a weather logging incident from a ridge station in eastern Tennessee. The report recorded a sudden temperature rise over a 10-minute interval with no storm pattern, no equipment malfunction, and no sustained atmospheric explanation. The line below it noted that nearby soil temperatures remained unchanged. Hawk took the page and read the numbers himself.
Heat signature without stable source.
As Hawk murmured, Brick crossed his arms.
So now the air's getting burned and nobody knows by what.
Hawk did not answer him directly. Instead, he placed the report at the center of the desk and looked at the others in turn.
Say it.
As Hawk said it, Miriam knew what he meant. The phrase had been sitting in the room all evening like a loaded object no one wanted to touch first. She inhaled once and read from the bottom line.
All readings normal.
The words fell into the lamp-lit office and changed it. Not because they were loud, but because now they had been said together in the open with full awareness of what they were doing. As Brick's jaw tightened, Lex's blue eyes did not leave the page. Hawk's expression went very still. There it was at last. No longer a filing oddity or clerical nuisance, but a sentence with intent behind it. All readings normal. After the phrase had been spoken aloud, the room did not erupt into theory the way a lesser team's room might have. Nobody started pacing. Nobody argued themselves into comfort. Instead, a deeper kind of attention took hold, one that made the walls feel closer and the air more exact. Brick lifted his abandoned mug, took one disgusted swallow of cold coffee, and set it back down with greater care than the situation required. Lex remained leaning over the desk, but not casually now. She was tracing the bottom third of several reports with one finger, not touching the ink directly, just following the final lines as if she could feel the point where authorship changed. Miriam shuffled 3 copies beside one another and began comparing not the words but the strike patterns, spacing, and misalignment. Hawk moved nothing for a full minute. He stood behind his chair with both hands resting on the back, eyes lowered toward the spread of files like a man examining tracks in fading light. The lamp on his desk threw hard little shadows beneath each paper edge. Outside, the yard lights had come on, and their glow painted pale bars across the window blind. The room seemed smaller than it had an hour earlier, more private, more chosen. Brick was the first to break the silence.
I hate that sentence.
Good. Means you heard it.
As Brick lets out a humorless breath.
I hear a lot of things I hate. Doesn't make them smart.
Lex did not look up.
It isn't smart. It's invasive.
Miriam passed 2 reports across to Hawk and tapped the bottom margin of the first.
The strike pressure changes here. Body text is uneven. Final line is darker, cleaner, different insertion.
Hawk compared it to the second and saw the same thing with less obvious contrast. On a third, the wording sat fractionally higher than the ruled line above it, the sort of error a careful typist would not make unless the page had been fed back into the machine later. Brick leaned over from the side and grimaced.
So we're saying a clerk somewhere is editing dozens of reports over decades for fun?
Miriam shook her head before Hawk could answer.
No clerk keeps this kind of consistency across agencies they don't control.
Lex drew one of the medical summaries closer and pointed at a timing notation.
This follow-up was added after the physician signed off. See the interval. 3 days later. No new exam. Yet the conclusion becomes calmer instead of more uncertain.
As she shifted to another page.
Same pattern here with structural review. Initial notes identify an anomaly. Final summary neutralizes it.
Brick folded his arms looking at the images.
Then someone with authority is scrubbing the edges.
Hawk looked up at him at last.
cough may just be.
Brick caught the tone immediately.
And maybe?
Hawk tapped the phrase with the eraser end of his pencil.
And maybe the authority doesn't originate where we want it to.
That hung in the room with a peculiar kind of weight because all four of them had begun privately to suspect the same impossible thing. Not just that people were cleaning the reports, but that the reports themselves seemed to acquire their clean ending whether people deserved that blame or not. Lex took one of the oldest files and held it under the lamp. The paper had gone soft with age, and the final line was just faint enough to force concentration.
This was inserted later. You can see it.
And yet the wording is already the same.
Brick looked between them.
You're making it sound like the line learned itself.
No one laughed, though in another room the phrasing might have earned one. Hawk sat down again and drew the Tennessee weather report toward him. Then the Louisiana utility report, then the Georgia barn incident, aligning their closing statements into a neat column.
Look at timing, initial event, confusion, irregular detail, then the record, settles. Always after the point where uncertainty should widen the investigation.
Miriam flipped through her notes and found the corresponding index.
Yes, it's consistent. The closure language appears right after the event has already been observed sometimes. Hours later. Sometimes days.
Lex straightened slowly.
Which means the phrase isn't recording the event.
Hawk finished the thought.
It's responding to it.
Brick stared at the stacked pages with visible distaste. He had spent too much of his life around physical evidence to enjoy language starting to behave like a witness with motive.
So what are we saying? That this thing happens, then something reaches back through the paperwork and tells everyone to calm down.
Hawk did not soften it.
I'm saying the anomaly may not end at the event site.
Lex crossed her arms.
It may continue into record, memory, interpretation.
Miriam added quietly.
Into the point where institutions decide what happened.
The office had gone so still by then that the ticking wall clock near the filing cabinet began to sound intrusive. Hawk finally lifted one report and turned it over to inspect the back for pressure marks from the typewriter. Brick watched him, then looked out toward the black glass of the window where his own reflection faintly shared the room with him. He did not like the direction this was leaning. He liked enemies that stood on ground, moved through weather, and bled when pressed. This felt older, subtler, more contemptuous of ordinary response.
You know what bothers me most?
As he asked, Miriam looked up from her notes.
That it isn't hiding cleanly. If this thing wanted secrecy, we wouldn't have any reports at all. Instead, it leaves the mess and cleans the...
Hawk's eyes lifted from the page.
Exactly.
Lex glanced toward him.
That suggests confidence.
Or habit.
Miriam turned one final report toward the center of the desk, the one from Tennessee where the numbers had briefly admitted heat without source before the summary flattened the event. Under the lamp, the final line looked darker than the rest of the page, as if it still held fresh authority no matter how old the ink. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Hawk placed his fingertip just beneath the sentence and said, in a voice almost too calm for the room,
"It wasn't written."
Brick's gaze hardened. Lex's jaw set. Miriam felt that same cold intelligence move through her spine. Hawk finished the thought without lifting his hand.
It was added.
The knock on Hawk's door came soft enough that it might have been ignored in another hour, but everyone in the room was tuned too tightly by then to miss even small interruptions. Miriam had been halfway through cross-checking dates when the sound came again, 2 measured taps with no impatience in them. Hawk looked toward the door, said,
"Come in."
The duty clerk stepped just far enough inside to hand over a newly arrived case folder before withdrawing with the peculiar speed of a man who knew when a room's temperature had shifted beyond his rank. The folder was plain brown, its top edge still curled from recent handling, the routing slip attached with a paperclip marked priority review. Hawk took it, glanced once at the county designation, and something in his shoulders drew inward. He laid it flat on the desk instead of opening it immediately. Brick noticed first.
What is it?
Hawk looked from the slip to Miriam.
This came from Baldwin Intake Rural Property Report.
Miriam's pencil stopped in her hand. Lex pushed off the wall and came closer without speaking. Baldwin County was not automatically special. They handled ordinary strangeness like everywhere else. Weather, fires, vanishings, bad luck, family lies. Yet the timing of the folder's arrival, paired with the work already spread across the desk, made the room feel suddenly less retrospective. Hawk opened the file. A faint smell of fresh mimeograph ink rose from the first page. Incident timestamp, night before. Approximate location, tree line. Witness uncertainty. Temperature irregularity. Brick did not need to see more to feel the room tilt into the present. Miriam stood and moved to Hawk's side so she could read over the page with him. The initial summary had the look of a local report forwarded upward by someone uncertain whether it belonged in any standard channel. Rural property near Fairhope. Family concern after late night absence. Subject observed moving toward tree line shortly before midnight. Ambient temperature drop recorded by a household thermometer and later disputed by responding personnel due to equipment inconsistency. Lex took the second sheet as Hawk passed it over. Supplemental note from a deputy. No immediate evidence of struggle. Ground conditions dry. Initial impressions at edge of tree line present, though the phrasing on that section had already become hesitant, as if the writer mistrusted his own eyes before he finished the sentence. Brick reached for the witness statement packet clipped behind the summary. Fragments. Bell heard on property at unspecified hour. Sensation of silence in woods. Watch or clock stoppage reported by one family member and not corroborated. He set the page down slowly.
This isn't clean enough for normal channels.
Hawk did not answer. He was reading the instrument log attached at the rear. A cheap household thermometer had recorded a steep temperature decline over a narrow window, then a return to baseline. The follow-up notation, however, cast doubt on the reading and suggested likely user error. Lex took the log from him, studied the numbers, and narrowed her eyes.
User error doesn't produce a smooth drop and recovery curve on a static instrument.
Miriam was already flipping to the last page, dread arriving before certainty. She found the closing note and went quiet. Hawk noticed.
What is it?
Miriam handed him the sheet. The final section had been entered after the first intake summary, probably during relay to the state coordination desk. It was brief, too brief. Temperature anomaly unconfirmed. Search conditions normal. No measurable environmental threat. Brick leaned in from behind Hawk's shoulder.
There it is.
The line at the bottom waited like a snake in warm dust. All readings normal. Lex exhaled through her nose, not surprised anymore, which was somehow worse. Hawk kept reading the pages before and after, as if he might catch the point where ordinary uncertainty gave way to that familiar closure, but the transition was seamless in exactly the way he now distrusted most. Miriam pointed to the witness timing notation.
This entered the system before the local follow-up was complete, but how?
Brick answered before anyone else could.
Because it was never waiting on the follow-up.
Lex had gone back to the initial summary and tapped the line describing the tree line entry.
Subject entered at approximately 2350, right on the threshold.
Hawk's gaze sharpened at that. The phrase itself did not mean much yet on the page, but the timing sat close enough to older patterns involving abrupt environmental shifts that even he could feel the knot tightening. Brick flipped to the deputy's statement again.
No exit path noted, not officially.
He set the paper down harder than he meant to.
That's a man disappearing into brush while the paperwork starts calming itself down before the sun comes up.
For the first time that evening, the room's work moved from analysis toward implication. It was one thing to handle old anomalies like broken bones lifted from the dirt. It was another to watch a fresh event slide directly into the same language they had spent hours dissecting. Hawk stepped away from the desk, took 2 paces toward the window, and stopped with his back to the room. Outside, the yard lamps cut pale geometry across the gravel. A truck moved along the perimeter road, slow and unimportant, and for a moment its headlights washed the glass and disappeared. Behind him, pages continued to shift as Lex and Miriam checked timestamps and routing marks. Brick stayed at the desk like a guard over a body. Hawk turned back around.
Read the local sequence again.
Miriam did, slower this time. Subject toward tree line. Temperature drop. Family concern. Deputy response. No confirmed environmental threat. All readings normal. When she finished, even the clock near the cabinet seemed to hesitate between ticks. Hawk returned to the desk and put his hand flat on the file, claiming the moment as much as the paper.
The system said nothing happened.
Brick muttered. Lex looked up from the log sheet, her voice almost too level.
Because nothing was allowed to...
No one contradicted her. The new case had entered the room like any other folder, but now it sat at the center of the desk like a live round. Subject entered. Subject did not exit. The paper had already begun closing over the wound. The restricted archive sat one level below the records room, behind a keyed steel door that required both Hawk's authorization and a second sign-off from the duty officer to open after hours. Brick had once joked that any file worth locking up that carefully was either boring beyond measure or catastrophic by committee. He stopped making that joke when he saw what the lower archive actually held. Older material. Originals when originals still existed. Incident binders too sensitive to circulate. Photographic negatives. Temperature reels. Field notebooks sealed in waxed envelopes. Items the institution had not trusted itself to summarize cleanly. After the Fairhope File hit Hawk's desk, the four of them descended there together without fanfare, the kind of shared movement that bypassed discussion because discussion would only slow the inevitable. The archive room smelled of cold metal, dry paper, and the faint mineral odor of concrete that never saw enough sunlight to lose its subterranean memory. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead. Rows of shelving stood in careful military order, and at the back wall sat 3 long map drawers beneath a rack of locked binders stamped with date bands rather than titles. Miriam handled the retrieval list. Hawk handled the keys. Lex handled the originals, as if she expected them to protest being touched. Brick watched the room itself more than the files, his body keeping the old habit of securing space even when the enemy remained theoretical. It did not stay theoretical for long. Miriam pulled the first binder in the sequence they needed, one attached to the foundational authorization packet for Site 47 construction. There, at last, was the question no one had previously been permitted to ask directly. Why here? The answer did not come in a single sentence. It emerged the way rot emerges when old boards are lifted, in layered evidence that had been dry for years but was not dead. Site 47 had not been established as a forward operating base in search of a mission. It had been placed in response to a spread of recurring events mapped across decades, clustered not by county or politics or existing infrastructure, but by overlap of certain environmental signatures. Miriam unfolded a translucent map sheet and laid it beneath the lamp. Across Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, and farther west, small red pins marked incidents involving unexplained thermal behavior, atmospheric pressure shifts, sudden silence zones, structural deformation without proper blast pattern, and repeat closure language in civil reports. The Fairhope area sat near no single epicenter, yet it lay disturbingly close to the crossing of several historical vectors, as if it occupied the place where multiple incomplete lines had been trying to meet for years. Brick stood with one hand on the shelf edge, staring down at the map.
This wasn't a response to one event.
No, it was a response to recurrence.
Lex opened an older engineering memo clipped behind the site placement review. One line described localized heat signatures absent visible combustion. Another referenced atmospheric compression readings inconsistent with known storm mechanics. Miriam had seen enough by then to stop being surprised when the institution sounded calmest at its most afraid.
They built 47 to watch the pattern.
Hawk corrected her quietly.
They built 47 because watching wasn't enough anymore.
The deeper they went, the stranger the shape of the pattern became. An after-action packet from 15 years earlier described a rail crossing shed, where every metal component on the southern wall had softened during a windless night. Though no fire had taken place and no nearby wood structure had taken even a scorch mark, a field ecology survey from the Ozarks included a handwritten note about birds refusing a corridor of air over a ravine for 3 consecutive mornings, while instruments logged nothing except a pressure deviation too brief to classify. Lex found a medical annex describing survivors from an industrial yard incident who presented with tissue trauma matching severe thermal insult, though their clothing, hair, and surrounding environment showed no burn progression consistent with exposure. Brick read a civil defense summary from coastal Louisiana, where a warehouse roof had bowed upward from internal force during a stormless hour, the support trusses curved as if heat and pressure had passed through them in a single directed sweep. Piece by piece, the shadow took shape without ever becoming a named thing. Heat without fire, pressure without wind, damage without proper transfer, structural warping without sustained combustion, and threaded through too many of the reports to dismiss. The language corrections that settled over the aftermath like an institution-wide reflex no one could trace to one author. Miriam found a typed memorandum buried in an administrative section, unsigned of course, recommending all future logging procedures reduce speculative descriptors and maintain public-facing normalcy unless direct mass casualty conditions force deviation.
Public-facing normalcy.
Brick repeated with contempt.
Pretty phrase for bury it.
Hawk took the memo from him.
Or for someone already losing ground and trying to slow the spread.
At the bottom of the third binder, beneath maps and incident grids and summary sheets that had all worked very hard not to say too much, lay a thin black folder unlike the rest. No dates on its outer band, no agency header. Inside were 6 pages only. The first listed criteria for facility placement. The second described regional recurrence intervals. The third contained atmospheric sketches and structural renderings marked with heat gradients that resembled no ordinary blast cone. The fourth included a phrase that made even Hawk hold still longer than usual. Persistent event intelligence suspected. Post-incident narrative stabilization observed. Lex read it once, then handed it to Miriam without comment. Miriam's eyes raced ahead to the next notation. Thermal anomalies without combustion. Localized pressure displacement. Pattern behavior suggests deliberate suppression of detectability through report normalization. Brick swore under his breath, not because the language was surprising now, but because seeing it formalized meant someone before them had stood this close to the edge and still failed to stop the slide. Hawk turned to the final page. There was no conclusion, only a typed recommendation. Establish permanent monitoring and rapid response node within regional overlap zone. Maintain restricted circulation. Avoid mythological terminology in all operational language. Brick let out a short, sharp laugh without humor.
That means somebody used it.
Lex's gaze remained on the structural sketches, the curved heat lines, the pressure arcs, the oddly elegant shapes of destruction that had touched wood, metal, tissue, and air in related ways without ever writing their own name across the page. Miriam looked from the document to the Fairhope file resting beside it on the table. The old reports and the new one belonged to the same appetite. Hawk closed the black folder with deliberate care.
Site 47 exists because this thing doesn't just happen.
He looked at the others, then at the binder stacks, then back to the black folder under his hand.
It edits.
When I come into you wrong, don't take me back.
Preparation at Site 47 did not look dramatic from a distance. That was part of its discipline. Nothing theatrical, nothing broadcast, nothing that would invite its own mythology before action could even begin. For those who knew the compound's ordinary pulse, the shift before deployment was unmistakable. By dawn, the motor pool lights were on, long white bands cutting across the mist, clinging low over the gravel. A pair of trucks idled near the maintenance bay, one fitted for personnel, one loaded with field cases whose markings had been deliberately simplified. Men moved in efficient lines rather than wandering clusters. Radios were checked low, not loud. Weapons were inspected without the swagger that often accompanied urgent assignments. Hawk stood near the open rear door of the lead truck with a clipboard in one hand and a folded map in the other. His loosened tie tucked beneath his jacket now, sleeves buttoned again as if the act of closing fabric over skin helped narrow the work ahead. Brick came across the yard carrying a field pack and 2 thermos flasks, handing one to Hawk without comment. Lex emerged from the infirmary annex with a medic case slung in one hand and a narrower black kit in the other, the one she had assembled herself for problems that did not fit approved categories. Miriam stood just inside the operations doorway with a stack of copied extracts held against her chest, watching the movement with the expression of someone who understood more than anyone had officially told her, and not yet enough to feel safe. Above them all, the morning sky remained a hard pale gray, not storming, not clear, as if even the weather had chosen not to declare itself. Hawk gathered them near the hood of the lead truck and unfolded the route map. The Fairhope sector lay marked in grease pencil, the rural access roads spidering away from town toward parcels where woods, fields, and forgotten structures met each other without neat lines. He kept the briefing spare. Entry team only. No outer agency notification until on-site assessment. Local interaction minimal. Environmental logging active from the moment of approach. Brick would handle ground read and perimeter logic. Lex would assess both human effects and physical trace if present. Miriam was not coming into the field on this run, but her role was no less central. She would remain in operations with the archive extracts, relay pattern correlation, and watch incoming paperwork for real-time stabilization drift. When Hawk said that last phrase, Brick's mouth tightened. They had begun using new language inside the team already because old language carried too much false reassurance.
And if local reports start cleaning themselves up while we're still en route?
Flag every change. Timestamp it. Don't argue with the pages. Just show us the shape.
Lex adjusted the strap on her medic case and looked toward the trucks.
You still think this is a single event site?
Hawk folded the map once.
No, I think it's a current expression.
Brick cracked the cap on his thermos, took a swallow, and muttered,
That's a real ugly way of saying it. Followed the pattern here.
Hawk did not dispute it. For a moment, the yard settled around them in the low mechanical hum of idling engines, clinking gear, and gravel shifting under boots. It might have felt ordinary to someone passing the perimeter fence. Men loading out. Another assignment. Another line on the schedule. But ordinary had stopped applying to this operation several binders ago, and all 4 of them knew it in different ways. Miriam stepped closer and offered Hawk the copied extracts she had prepared. Included among them were the Fairhope intake summary, the atmospheric notes from the old overlap maps, and the black folder page describing post-incident narrative stabilization. Hawk tucked them into his case. Lex took one look at the top sheet and said,
If you see any new closure language before we radio in, call it immediately.
I will, Commander.
Brick glanced back toward the operations doorway.
Lock the archive after us.
Miriam's answer came quick.
Already done.
That earned the faintest hint of approval from him. Hawk looked from one face to the next. This was not camaraderie in the easy sense. None of them needed speeches. What bound them now was harder and more useful. Shared refusal. Shared pattern recognition. Shared willingness to walk toward a thing that had spent years persuading institutions to call it normal. Hawk set one hand on the truck door.
We are not going down there to prove a theory. We are going to observe cleanly, secure what's there, and refuse the first lie it offers.
Lex's gaze stayed level.
And the second?
Into the cab, then paused.
Same as the first.
As the team mounted up, Miriam remained by the doorway, arms folded around her notes against the morning chill. She watched Brick settle into the passenger side, Lex secure her kits in the rear, Hawk lean across the seat for the radio check. Behind the convoy, the compound stretched out in blocks of concrete, steel, chain link, and utility lines, all the practical architecture men built when they wanted to believe practicality could hold the line against older things. A faint shimmer lifted over the far edge of the yard beyond the berm, so brief it might have been fuel vapor, morning light, or tired eyes catching heat where no heat belonged. Miriam saw it and said nothing at first, because naming such moments too early had become a kind of superstition she no longer trusted. Then Hawk looked back through the windshield as if he had felt her attention change. She raised one hand and pointed toward the horizon. By the time the others turned, the shimmer was gone. Only the gray morning remained, Brick swore softly. Lex said nothing. Hawk held Miriam's gaze for a second longer, then nodded once. Not dismissal, not comfort, only acknowledgement that the pattern had already begun moving before the first tire left gravel. The truck engines rose, gears caught, and the convoy rolled toward the gate under a sky that refused to promise anything. Miriam stood alone with the papers hugged tight to her chest and listened until the sound faded beyond the perimeter road. Then she went back inside to the records room, where silence waited beside the files like a patient animal. On Hawk's desk upstairs, beneath the lamp left burning, the Fairhope folder lay open to its final line. All readings normal.
The office was immaculate, not sterile, but maintained with a precision that bordered on ritual. Polished wood floors reflected a soft amber glow. Between them, mounted artifacts rested with equal importance, carved stone fragments marked with unfamiliar symbols, dulled metals, and small statues shaped just close enough to human to feel wrong. Many were gold, others darker, older, each one placed with care. All of them faced inward, toward the center of the room, toward whoever owned this place, beside unearthed structures that did not belong to any known catalog. Glass cases lined the far wall, holding rarer pieces under perfect conditions. Wealth was here, but not for display. This was accumulation, long-term, deliberate. A lifetime of collecting, or perhaps more than one. The room did not feel decorated. It felt curated, as if every object had been waiting to be found and brought here, where it now sat in perfect order. The camera moved slowly through the space, silent, observing, passing over surfaces that had not known dust in years. Nothing was out of place, nothing disturbed, the stillness so complete it felt preserved rather than lived in. Then the telephone rang, sharp and clean, breaking the quiet with something that did not belong. Once, twice, 3 times, each ring echoing too precisely through the room, as if it carried from somewhere just outside the boundaries of the space. On the 4th ring, a voice answered, female, calm and controlled, without hesitation or surprise. She spoke evenly, as though continuing a conversation already in motion. He took the assignment. A brief pause followed, measured, deliberate. He's in Fairhope. Another beat, softer now, but certain. You should have a report soon. His findings will confirm the pattern. Silence stretched on the line, not empty, but occupied, as if something listened without breathing. Then another voice responded, also female but different, smoother, quieter, and somehow closer, as if it did not travel through the phone at all. Well done. The second voice settled into the room with a faint hum that seemed to press against the air itself. This will serve as a grounding point for what comes next. The camera continued forward, past the desk, past the artifacts, toward the rear wall where the structure of the room began to feel less certain. At first it appeared seamless, wood paneling aligned perfectly, but then the line revealed itself, a doorway, old and out of place, the kind found in the lower level of a house that had outlived its original purpose. The door was already open. A single black telephone cable stretched from the desk across the polished floor and disappeared into the darkness beyond the threshold. The first voice carried faintly now, as if distance had shifted without movement. All things are moving as planned. The camera crossed the threshold, and the air changed instantly, warm, heavy, saturated with steam that rolled outward like breath from something alive. The office behind already felt distant, less certain, as though it had never fully belonged to the same space. Inside, the room was no longer a room but a cavern, rough stone walls damp and uneven, stretching beyond what the structure should allow. The floor dipped slightly, slick with moisture, heat shimmering through the air. Mirrors lined the walls, dozens of them. Old glass with tarnished edges and warped reflections, each one catching fragments of the space and bending them, repeating them, watching. The cable continued forward, vanishing into the thickening fog. The deeper the movement, the less the office existed behind it, swallowed by steam and silence. Shapes shifted within the haze, slow and massive, movement that could not be fully seen but could be felt. For a brief moment, something caught the light, smooth and reflective, silver, a tail pulling itself further into the unseen, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Then the second voice returned, closer now, too close, threaded with quiet amusement. Oh my. A soft, knowing laugh followed. You can't pull the curtains back this time, my little friends. The mirrors distorted without moving, each reflection lagging, then snapping back into place as if time itself had slipped and corrected. The steam surged, hotter, thicker, pressing forward until the space narrowed to almost nothing. The camera staggered, no longer steady, forced backward as if the air itself rejected intrusion. The office beyond flickered, distant and unreal, while the voice stretched thin through the pressure. Not this time. The steam struck like a wall, white and blinding, sound collapsing into a low, crushing hum that swallowed everything. Then impact. A body hit the floor back in the office, hard, unmoving. The telephone sat silent on the desk, the cable no longer shifting. The doorway was gone, seamless again, as though it had never existed. The room returned to perfect order, perfect stillness, untouched. On the desk, a single sheet of paper remained where it had been left. All readings normal. Somewhere beyond sight, faint and distant, laughter lingered just long enough to suggest it had never truly left at all.
MC Hype Voice, South Florida. We got 2 DJs, 1 mix table, left side of the decks.
DJ BearKlaw!
Right side of the decks.
DJ Misty Dragon!
Backline holding the groove, the Watchtower Saints.
Where BearKlaw comes.
Fort Lauderdale, you feel that bass? I'm warming up the claws tonight. Drum and bass rolling like thunder off the coast. Who's ready?
BearKlaw! BearKlaw!
Alright, Dragon, your turn. Pumpin' on beach, Deerfield Beach. I see you dancing out there, I brought the thunder, but I brought the fire, watch this drop.
Dragon, dragon, dragon!
Woo! You got fire,
You got bass!
let's see who shakes Sunrise Boulevard first, or who lights up Miami Beach. South Florida, choose your side. Left side for BearKlaw, right side for Misty Dragon. Work hard,
Play hard!
dance harder,
Dance harder!
dance harder,
Dance harder!
Fort Lauderdale,
Buffalo Beach, Deerfield Beach!
if you can hear my voice, you have the right to
Dance!
3, 2, 1.
Grab it!
Alright, Dragon, choose for the final drop. Only if South Florida is ready.
2 DJ!
1 mix table, Miss Ain't for the power, still this ain't on the beat.
South Florida! This rock belongs to you! South Florida way!
You've been dancing all night.
Lauderdale!
I see you moving, Pompano Beach. You're bringing the heat. Deerfield Beach, the floor is shaking. And down the coast, Miami Beach. Are you ready?
Lauderdale!
Let me hear that energy.
Raise those hands!
The claws are ready. Bring that fire, feel the rhythm rising. Dragon flame in the baseline.
D-Bill 2 DJs!
1 mix table, 1 mix table. If you can hear my voice, you have the right to 3, 2, 1.
Loaded! Hey! Pompano Beach, Deerfield Beach! Hey! Pompano Beach, Deerfield Beach! Hey! Pompano Beach, Deerfield Beach!
Dragon,
Ready!
let's shake the coast.
Hey! Dragon!
If you can hear my voice, you have the right to
Dance! 3, 1, drop it!
drop it,
Drop it! Bass blow!
drop it, drop it,
Lights roll!
drop it, drop it.
Lights go!
From Fort Lauderdale to Deerfield Beach, to the lights of Miami Beach. Tonight, the coast moved as one. DJ BearKlaw, DJ Misty Dragon. Back by the Rhythm Guardians, the Watchtower Saints.
South Florida. Keep dancing, let your crowd chant. Who owns the night? We do. Who brings the bass? BearKlaw. And when the beat drops, we dance. We dance. So ultra short drop. BearKlaw. For Tabby, drop that bass. BearKlaw. 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 Drop that bass. Fort Lauderdale. Hey, Papaya Beach, you feel beach. Hey, Papaya Beach, you feel beach. Hey, Papaya Beach, you feel dance. If you can hear my voice, you have the right to. If you can hear my